Chapter 45. Treadon Nelson. Blood dripped down the side of the altar, running onto the floor with the golden specks in the hematite. Ellie struggled, pulling her wrist free from Xander's grasp and rolling away, but he caught her by the back of the shirt and slammed her head down against the stone. Treadon felt the pain like it was his own, but it only fueled the rage rising inside him. The two creatures growled above them, crouching down as the other two circled around the opposite sides of the desk, surrounding them. "No way I'm going down," curled up in a ball. Jaren jumped to his feet, fists in front of his face. One of the creatures lunged, but Treadon stood and slammed the ink pen into the creature's eye. It stopped, turning its head almost all the way around so it could look at Treadon with its good eye. The door slammed open. Rachel and Abigail stepped into Xander's office, pulling the attention of all four creatures and Xander away from their current battles. Treadon took advantage of the creature's distraction and pulled the pin from its eye. The creature lunged again, and Treadon shoved the pin into the creature's mouth, jamming the point up through the palate, crunching through bone. The creature's teeth sank into his forearm. Treadon fell back against the wall, pain shooting through his arm. The creature disintegrated before it could close its mouth all the way. Treadon dropped the pin. There was a puncture wound between the two bones of his arm. It wasn't bleeding. The hole oozed a dark substance, and his skin turned a rotting black. Abigail held a mace in each hand. Green stones tipped the sharp points protruding from the metal balls at the top. She wore a red chain mail vest, thick leather pants, and black boots that looked like they could punt a football to the moon. "Mom? Rachel?" Jaren echoed Treadon's disbelief. Rachel looked like a warrior from a comic book. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail with shards of green rock clipped to the ends of her hair like tiny pointed daggers. She held a short sword in one hand and a three-pronged weapon in the other. The three creatures charged at the two women. Rachel spun, catching the creature across the jaw with the end of her ponytail, following the strike with a jab to the creature's ribcage. It disintegrated to dust. With a battle cry, Abigail swung the mace and crushed a creature's skull. Before it had completely disappeared, she pulled a bag from a pocket and tossed red dust at the last creature. It sneezed, then began convulsing, the skin growing sores and oozing where it contacted the red dust. Rachel brought her sword around, cutting off the creature's head. Xander had to cover his face as a small amount of red dust reached him, but he didn't lose his grip on Ellie. He held her down with one hand around her neck. Jaren ran across the room to Rachel. "What are you doing here? And where did you get a sigh? You know Raphael was my favorite turtle." He shook his head and grabbed her shoulders, dropping the wall, flipping the switch. "If you're here and I'm about to die, that means I can't protect you. That means I can't keep you safe." Treadon stepped closer to Xander, but Xander only tightened his grip on Ellie's neck, her fingers scraping uselessly against his hand. She couldn't breathe. Treadon stopped as Xander put up his hand, calling more of those creatures from the ground. Treadon didn't know how many there were, maybe an endless amount. They could fight these dogs all night, while Ellie died. He tested his grip. The pain in his arm was intense, but he focused on Ellie, on the fight going on around him. The growls and barks sounded from the hallway. Abigail turned toward the door. She stood tall and straight, confidence Treadon had never seen in her, but realized had always been there. She was herself with the weapons in her hand, and the smear of black creature remains across her forehead. Rachel leaned in and pressed her lips to Jaren's, her weapons held to the side. "Have you stopped to consider the fact that I'm meant to protect you?" She stepped back into the hall. "We'll keep these guys busy. You get Ellie." They turned to face the creatures. Xander growled and lifted Ellie up by the neck, her feet kicking in the air. Treadon launched himself forward and wrapped his arms around Xander, pinning Xander's arms to his side and forcing him backward. Xander lost his grip on Ellie's neck, and she fell back to the altar. Treadon pulled Xander away, stumbling to the center of the room. All he had to do was hang on until Ellie and Jaren could get out of the room. Abigail and Rachel were slicing, dicing, and crushing the dog-like creatures out in the lobby. But when one creature disintegrated, another took its place. They were being pushed back from the hallway toward the office. There was only a small space for them to escape through the door. Jaren was by Ellie's side, helping her off the altar. Xander twisted, trying to knock Treadon off like a mechanical bull. Their feet kicked the white dagger that had dropped to the floor earlier, and it skidded to Jaren's feet. He picked it up. He and Ellie headed toward the door. "I'm not finished." Xander spoke through gritted teeth. He burst free of Treadon's hold with a strength that defied reality. Treadon fell to the ground, holding his wounded arm and rolling back and forth as his vision blackened around the edges. Jaren turned and threw the dagger at Xander's throat. His aim was dead center, but the knife slowed in the air. Xander lifted one arm straight and shoved it toward the knife. All Xander's energy seemed to be focused on slowing the dagger in the air. It stopped an inch from his throat. Xander's hands were shaking, beads of sweat popping out on his forehead, concentration causing a small wrinkle in the wax features. The knife turned in the air. The tip pointed at Jaren's heart. Jaren didn't flinch, didn't move out of the way. He stared at his dad as if daring him to kill his own son. Xander showed no remorse as his hands pulled back like they were preparing to shove the dagger through the air. Treadon was out of time. He pushed himself up, grabbing Xander again. This time, when he pinned Xander's hands to his side, the dagger clattered to the ground. Treadon squeezed as hard as he could, and he struggled to hang on. He squeezed with his upper arms, but his hold was loosening. He didn't understand what was happening until he realized his feet were no longer touching the floor. Xander was growing. His body was larger than Treadon's arms could encircle. Xander grew taller and wider until his head hit the 10-foot ceiling. Treadon's grip failed. He slipped and started to fall. But Xander's gigantic hand shot out and caught Treadon by the throat. The hand was large enough for the fingers to encircle his neck, and he felt the pressure as Xander began to squeeze. Treadon twisted helplessly, his feet dangling. Xander's face had ballooned out, his nose pulling flat, his jaw stretching forward. Xander's eyes bulged from his head. The beast that used to be Xander Caliban roared in anger, shaking Treadon's body like a rag doll, shooting spittle across the room. Treadon could barely grip Xander's wrists with both hands as he fought to get free. Then Jaren was there, jumping off the ground, grabbing Xander's massive forearm. Jaren opened his mouth and bit into the flesh of Xander's arm, clenching his teeth and pulling his head back sharply. A large chunk of distorted skin and muscle ripped from Xander's arm, and the monster released Treadon as he threw his head back and let out a blood-curdling roar. Treadon fell to the floor. Xander lifted his arm in the air, Jaren still dangling, going back in for another bite. Xander swung his arm down like a man attacking a fly with a newspaper. The arm came down on top of Jaren, slamming him to the floor with the snap of a bone. Jaren yelled. His leg twisted and bent at an unnatural angle. "Jaren!" Rachel screamed. She watched him fall, but another creature attacked her before she could move. Abigail fought next to her, hair escaping her tight bun, flying around her head like angry snakes. More dog-like creatures blocked the entrance into the office. Ellie leaned against the far wall, unable to get to the door, her strength seeping out of her as she slipped down to the floor. He was going to fail. Treadon could feel the chances of success slipping away. The momentum was gone. Their offense was out of plays. The other team was ahead. Their loss was assured. The fear gripped him around the neck, sat on his chest, and made his legs feel weak. Xander's body was shaped more like a giant ape than a man. He raised his arm again, fist curled into a ball, like a hammer ready to fall. Treadon crawled backward, and his hand hit the white dagger that had fallen to the floor. The blade seemed short compared to the giant of a man in front of him. From hilt to point, the dagger was as long as Ellie's forearm. It felt like trying to fend off a giant with a needle, but it was all he had. Xander swung his arm, appearing to pull all his force into his fist, aimed at Jaren. Treadon threw himself between Xander and Jaren, using his whole body to thrust the dagger up and into Xander's chest. The entire weight of Xander's colossal body fell on the point of the upturned knife. The dagger buried itself into Xander's chest, a black smoke erupting from the wound, smelling of rotten eggs and burning plastic. Treadon's fingers sunk into the enlarged muscles of Xander's chest, and he had to let go of the dagger to pull his hands free. A black gore covered his fingers. There was a hissing sound, like air escaping through a hole in a balloon. Xander staggered back, stretching to his full height, knocking chunks of ceiling to the floor. His head thrashed back and forth as an inhuman scream escaped his mouth. Treadon watched in horror as skin fell from Xander's face and hands, like small grains of sand pulling away from his body. As more of Xander fell away, the tiny pieces began to spin as if caught in some whirlwind. The grains of sand bit into Treadon's face, and he raised one hand for protection. He crawled along the floor, finding Jaren. He helped Jaren to the wall where Ellie sat with her arms crossed over her stomach. The intensity of the sand increased. The three of them huddled together, trying to protect their faces against the wind. The wind blew the door shut. Abigail and Rachel stuck on the outside. The sand pulled at his clothes and bit into his exposed skin. The sand hit the glass windows and scraped along the marble floor with an awful grating noise. The pressure in the room increased until Treadon felt like his eardrums might explode. There was a deafening crack. The entire wall of glass windows shattered outward as the sand escaped. The pressure reduced and the whirlwind of sand lessened, escaping into the night. Treadon opened his mouth to flex his jaw, popping his ears. He peeked over his arm that was wrapped protectively around Jaren and Ellie. The real Xander lay on the floor in the middle of the room, the white dagger sticking out of his chest.